It's good? Okay, we're ready. Now I want to tell you that I am operating without my notes today because my book I left at my house and it is more than an hour's drive away. So I am speaking from a clean copy of Levis. So I hope I will be able to remember what I prepared, and I apologize in advance for the fact that I'm not as prepared as I should be. Sorry, I left my book at home. We are on page 45. I would like to back up a little bit into page 44 to set the context of the discussion of The Secret Sharer, which is the name of a book, a story, by Joseph Conrad, which illustrates a point that Levis is trying to make. So, let us look back at page 44. In the first sentence of the first full paragraph, Levis says, "The nature of livingness in human life is manifest in language." And he was trying to describe something about the nature of human life. Now, the Cartesians always talk about life in biological terms. Either you're alive or you're dead. If you are alive, your heart is beating, you're breathing, etc. But Levis is not talking about on or off, a sort of binary understanding. He is talking about something that must be apprehended intuitively. So in Dickens' Little Dorrit, the idea is creativity is the characteristic of life. But in another story or book, someone might choose a different criterion for life. For example, Patrick Henry, a great hero of American history, said, "Give me liberty or give me death." To him, the characteristic, the necessary characteristic of life was freedom. And you can imagine other things that someone might equate with life. In the passage we are going to consider today, there is another characteristic of human life which is described and illustrated, and really the word is evoked. Evoked in the story The Secret Sharer. So we're going to explore that today. Now I'm also going to remind you that William Blake made this statement: "Though I call them mine, I know they are not mine." Blake was claiming to be inspired by something outside himself, which enabled him to be a channel to produce his art. This points to the existence of a third realm, the objective existence, which is a lot of what we are exploring in this book. Moving on to the next paragraph, which we also studied at the bottom of 44, page 44. Levis says, "The bearing of this point on my theme," and the point being that an artist would claim to be inspired and be a channel of their art. The bearing of that on Levis's theme comes out in the answer made by Lawrence near his end to the visiting young novelist who asked him what was the drive behind his creative work. And Lawrence replied that the drive was moral, that he was trying to do something for the race, for the human race. So, the bearing of this point about artists channeling the inspiration of something else through themselves to the world is reflected in the idea that an artist is impelled by a moral consideration in producing his art. An artist, it is impressed upon the artist almost as a duty to bring forth the insights that he is capable of bringing forth for the human race. Hold on one second. I'm having a lot of lightheaded problems. Can we get some crackers and maybe some cheese? Thank you. And just if we just put it here, it'll be within reach. Thank you. Okay, let us continue. Okay, so in some sense, the artist is obligated to give his ideas to the world. And then the paragraph went on to talk about a liberal perspective that would jump for anti-Laurentian comment on the word moral. So they felt it was a morality of codes. And this is very important to what we'll study tonight. From a Cartesian perspective, morality is a system of laws and code. Olavo used the term schematic. When he and I were discussing this. And last week, we talked about the 3 levels of law. There was the code in the middle as a baseline, and above it was individual responsibility. This refers to a human ability to intuitively know what they should do without referring to a schematic, to a code. Human beings are in the image of God. We are given an organ called conscience. And as our conscience is developed, we are able to know at the bottom of our heart, in our honest integrity, what we should do without reference to a standardized code. Now, the code does apply. The code educates the conscience. The code forms the conscience. And the code informs the conscience. So let me write those 3 words. The code educates the conscience. It forms the conscience, and it informs the conscience. You know what educates means. And form means to shape it. What I mean by informs means when a human being is confronted by a moral dilemma, they immediately can refer to the code, the commandments of God, and that code will inform their decision. It will give input to them, but it will not dictate the decision. So, we have 3 levels of law. We have the code, which is a baseline. We have individual responsibility, which requires a person to be developed, to grow. It requires some training to get up into it. And then beneath we have we are now in the revolutionary mentality. Which in our day means people, common people, uneducated or uncultured people, feel they are above the law, that they don't need to obey the law because they can dream about a society where law would be unnecessary, a better society. And then they excuse themselves from the obligation of obeying the law that is in place in our society to protect us from one another. And they fall beneath into lawlessness. So, the Cartesians want to jump on Lawrence because he says he has a moral obligation to write, and they think he is speaking out of the code, but in fact he is speaking out of individual responsibility, that he must benefit the race by being a channel of some sort of knowledge that will improve the level of life in humanity. So, all of that takes us up to where we will begin tonight. Now, before we actually begin, I want to read in unbroken reading the paragraph before and the portion we are doing tonight, because I received an email from a student who is making an audio version, and he's asked me to be sure to read unbroken paragraphs. So hold on one second. Okay, I'm going to begin I think I'll begin at the bottom of 44 with the sentence beginning, "the bearing of this point on my theme." Okay. Page 44 at the very bottom. The bearing of this point on my theme comes out in the answer made by Lawrence near his end, to the visiting young novelist who asked him what was the drive behind his creative work, which went on until his death. One writes out of one's moral sense, for the race, as it were. I can imagine an enlightened intellectual pouncing triumphantly for anti-Laurentian comment on that word moral. But Lawrence's use of the word has a significance very remote from that which such a critic, in his routine way, assumes. To make plain what the actual significance is, I should, discussing the issue with students, turn to a short story of Conrad's called The Secret Sharer. It is brief, but obviously the work of a great writer, one notably unlike Lawrence, and it might have been written in order to help me enforce my point. I have discussed the tale and, inevitably seeing its nature, from my present point of view, in a critique that is very accessible, and I needn't here attempt to summarize either the tale or the discussion. It will, I think, sufficiently serve my purpose, and with best economy, if I quote a passage from my critique. This brief exchange takes place between the young ship's master in his first command and the head that, looking over the side as he keeps his first night watch, he sees at the bottom of the rope ladder that shouldn't have been left hanging there. "I suppose your captain's turned in." "I'm sure he isn't," I said. "Look here, my man, could you call him out quietly?" I thought the time had come to declare myself. "I am the captain." The inquirer explains that he has killed a man, and that he has escaped from confinement on his ship, moored there behind the island, by swimming. "My father's a parson in Norfolk. Do you see me before a judge and jury on that charge?" The young captain doesn't. He knows by immediate intuition that this isn't a case of a ship's officer versus a social offender, but of two completely self-reliant and fully human individuals, each the focus of the highest kind of moral responsibility. The irony, not of a reductive, but an intensifying kind, that enforces this, the fact and the recognition, that is, it comes out incidentally, they are both Conway boys. Some knowing psychological and esoteric subtlety has been written about the double. The significance, however, is not psychological, but moral. I don't mean by that to endorse the modish, esoteric suggestiveness you find served up about guilt or guilt feelings in the young captain, and of course in us. The young captain has no guilt feelings. That's essential to the significance. But he would have had guilt feelings if he had not recognized his supreme moral and human responsibility and acted on it. He sees in the double who has killed a man an alter ego. It might very well have been myself who had done it. That is his attitude. He doesn't mean humbly that he might have been guilty. There's no question of guilt by the criterion that's invoked in Conrad's art. By which I don't mean that the spirit of it is Genesis von Gut und Bös,